Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read Initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth, and today I have the pleasure of Dr. Nathanial Swain joining me for a second time so we can look at some of his favorite tools and resources and strategies in the classroom. Last month, we spoke to him about his teaching journey and realized it wasn't that direct path to being a classroom teacher. He kind of took a circuitous route to get there. So, Dr. Swain, do you want to give us just a quick recap of where you started to where you are now before we go into your class?
Sure. So I started my journey in linguistics and did a Bachelor of Arts in Linguistics and was very fascinated by language and everything that makes it up. And literacy wasn't a big part of that study because linguistics and linguists tend to study oral language much more closely. But after that, I then trained as a speech pathologist and worked in that space, helping young people with language and literacy difficulties, especially those adolescents I was really interested in. My PhD work was then in youth justice, working with young people struggling with their reading and writing and oral language. And it's there my eyes were opened up to just how wrong the journeys of young people in school can be, and how effective teaching could be the answer to preventing these problems from becoming really big and getting on top of these issues and challenges very early, so young people do feel like they are succeeding at school, and school is a place for them rather than a place for them to avoid. So after that, after working back in schools after my PhD, I really was drawn to my original sort of a recommendation from my mum that I should become a teacher and that I should try and work from within the classroom and from within schools as well as on the outside, as I had been working and supporting teachers. So that's where I went back and got my teaching degree and have now been enjoying working in the classroom and helping young students in their first year of school learn how to read and write. And there's nothing more satisfying than seeing that happening in real time.
It's amazing. I love that. That little light bulb that goes off when they figure they can do it. I've got a 5-year-old right now, and just seeing all the lights go off in her head is just amazing and really, really joyful. So, as a classroom teacher, you started out with a lot more background knowledge in terms of the English language, the speech sounds, and how those come together on
Mm,
the uh, listening side of things. And then
definitely.
I remember I took a couple linguistic courses in university, and having the background that I did with, Orton Gillingham tutoring, uh, and just realizing, oh yeah, well that makes it easy.
Mm.
Um, so how do you feel that that makes your teaching strategies and the resources you use different from, say, a teacher that doesn't have that linguistic background from the beginning?
I think the way that I think about it is I've always I've built up my knowledge of the what and the why of early reading and writing instruction, and I'm really passionate about just what those fundamental components are and the like why they're just so important. I also have in the back of my mind, all of the explanations if a child wants to know why a word is spelt a particular way or how to break a word down, or at my fingertips I've got a lot more of a grasp of sentence structure and why students might make certain errors or what things they might struggle with, and the kinds of difficulties that kids encounter that I've supported with them in a one-on-one context. What I've really been honing is my understanding of the how. So how do I bring all of that knowledge and all of that understanding of just what good instruction should include? How do I make that come to life on a daily basis, and how do I build those routines so that it's something that continually grows? And as a teacher, you're not always thinking, okay, what am I going to do today, or how am I going to do it? Like trying to make some of those things routinized so you can then focus on the learners and focus on what they're giving back. So certainly a lot of the background knowledge that teachers need to learn when they realize that there is this science of reading and they've missed out at university. I haven't had to do that huge sort of undertaking of professional learning, but what I've been learning so much is all about how to best make that come alive in the classroom. And some of the ways that we do that is at our school we Think about our literacy instruction into three main components and three main parts of the block. So we've got a 50-minute session that's all about literacy skills. And we focus on obviously phonemic awareness, the building of word reading, decoding, and encoding. So reading and spelling increasingly challenging words. But at the beginning of the year, we just started with simple CVC words or VC words, and now we're up to words that have three consonants before the vowel or three consonants after the vowel. And in the next few weeks, we'll be looking at long vowels for the first time. So it starts very slowly and builds up over time. The other parts of the skills session are things including the handwriting instruction, which goes for about 10 minutes. There's a paired fluency session, which goes for 10 minutes as well, where they read in pairs, decodable readers, and the teacher can float around and hear how they're reading and provide support or extra instruction in that time. But the best thing about the paired fluency is that they're sort of working together with a like sort of peer, sort of slightly higher or slightly lower than themselves. And then the last part is vocabulary instruction, where we teach new vocabulary and also new morphemes. So with preps, we're just starting, so that's the first year of school, we're just starting to introduce some prefixes this term, which is really exciting. So they'll get their first prefix on Monday, which is very cool. So a lot of them are very interested in how words are put together, and they got really excited looking at plurals when we looked at CV, CC words, and just started putting S's on the ends of words like cat and bit and tap and things like that. And they're like, oh, we know what a plural S is, and they got really excited. So I think they'll get really excited again about the morphology of prefixes as well. So that's the skills block, which we call forms, which is the name of our sort of curriculum that we've put together to sort of bring this to life. And Shane Pearson's the author of that, and it's an incredible resource that's actually going to be available to any school to use. And it's got daily sort of slides and resources ready to go that our school has been sort of pulling together, and that Shane has been sort of honing and crafting, which is amazing. They're built for Australian vowels, so there's going to be some things with international audiences. It's not always going to look the same, but in the early stages, it's certainly very applicable. And also the morphology slides, which happen from the spelling session turns into basically a morphology vocabulary session from year 3 onwards, because their basic decoding and spelling is under sort of control by that point, or by that point in the program. So the morphology is definitely applicable for an international audience as well. The other two, just to give you the overview before we go deeper, the other two parts of our literacy block are a session on writing instruction. So we call it Write to Learn, and that's where we learn the building blocks of sentences and paragraphs and compositions in upper year levels. So with our first year students this year, we've been looking at the components of a sentence and building little sentences. So whether it's doing a lot of things in an oral sort of format before we've been able to transcribe our work. So the students might provide ideas and fill in blanks in sentences, and I can talk to you more about that as well. But basically they're getting a sense of how to be a writer and make choices as a writer in a very sort of discreet way to begin with. Which is exciting. And then the last part is what we call Read to Learn, which is our opportunity to use our reading skills. In this case, it's mainly teacher facilitated reading, so reading to the students in order to learn things. So whether it's learning from literature, learning from texts about the world, so science, the humanities, history, geography, that sort of thing. And we've done a range of different units, and that's sort of how we embed our humanities and social sciences sort of within our reading block, which is a really clever thing, because you're building background knowledge in order to help them to comprehend texts, which they can then continue building in their upper years as well, and it just sort of builds. But that's basically how we make it come to life in our school. And in my classroom, we follow a similar structure across the whole school. It just looks a bit different with the first year of school. And it's amazing how much all of those components sort of interrelate together and how they come together in a really beautiful way. And obviously it's only one way of doing it. You can carve up that time and carve up that work with students in many different ways, but we're finding this sort of mix is nice, because it helps keep certain things discrete, that allows the teacher to focus on certain elements, so not getting them to think about their handwriting and spelling so much when they are focusing on crafting and composition, because it's very hard to do two of those things at once. helping them to focus on the knowledge of what they're doing, and what they're learning from reading when they're looking at the read to learn sort of session, rather than not just focusing on the basics of decoding in that point. So having those things separately worked upon, I think, is working well so far.
That's great. Well, one thing that I want to jump in before we go on to whatever brilliant thing you're going to talk about next is talking about that introduction of the plural S very
Mm,
quickly when
mm,
you're doing that phonics instruction, when you're working for the CVCC words. So you're not just assuming that the students can figure it out on their own when
mm,
by just adding an S, and you're not saying it's just a word. You're actually going in and explicitly teaching that plural S. What does that
mm.
look like?
So it's quite it's a brief sort of explicit teaching moment because the focus is on the decoding and encoding, but it's that little nugget of information that helps them realize that as students discover with their language, that it's not just encoding sound, like our code also encodes meaning. And so if you get that first morpheme, such as a plural S, you then realize that certain letters do other things than just differentiate between different words. They actually change words and do things that are functional and meaningful. So we would just sort of, for instance, we'd have a range of CVC words on the slide, and I think this session might be one of the ones that are available on the Forms website that people can have a look at and see how we do it. It's sort of, we'll have things like cat and tap and it's hard to think of words on the spot. Other CVC words on the slide, and sort of we know how to read CVC words at this point. It's like week 12 or week 13 in the program. And then on the other side of the slide, we then have those same words with an extra S added to them. And then there's a picture that shows this is one cat and this is two cats. This is one tap and these are three taps. So we say plural means more than one, and plural is showed with the plural S. And that's why we read it as cats and taps and so on. And so you're getting them to hear it, but also to understand what that is doing. And a lot of them have, if they're oral language, like English language users, then they have an intuitive sense of what plural is. They know that there's one cat and two cats. You can't say three cat, you have to say three cats. And so they know that there's a rule there, but now you've just drawn their awareness to it in a way that's really developmentally sort of accessible for them, and also gets them to think about when they're starting to transcribe some of their ideas and starting to experiment with writing, they can remember, oh yeah, there's that plural sort of s on the end that can help me with writing more than one thing. So it's very subtle, and it doesn't take a huge amount of time with the lesson because the focus is on that decoding and encoding and making sure they can hear that sound and transcribe that sound, and then blend it back together. But it's a really nice introduction, and a really gentle introduction to morphology, which is to come, and which becomes the bread and butter of the work in the upper years, because the general spelling is under control, and to really unlock the powers of the English language in the upper years, you have to go into morphology and etymology.
Of course. Now, when you're doing those initial GPCs or grapheme phoneme correspondence instructions, how many new graphemes are you introducing in a week?
So I think it works out to be about 3 or 4 in the initial few weeks, and then that reduces down to 2 as we've built up a lot. So I think in the first 5 weeks we do say SATP is like the first 4, and some people will choose different ones, but those are pretty useful to make some CVC words, so it's a pretty good set to choose. The next ones will be another 4, and now you're testing me. I can't exactly remember which 4 it is, but it's the other ones that I haven't thought of. So maybe IM is one of them.
The SATPIN words, right?
SATPIN, yeah. So it's either SATPIN or SATPIM. I think it might be M first because it's an easier one to visualize, and then N comes later. But anyway, it's much for muchness. We know that the research doesn't say that one set should be introduced before the other. It's just that have a sequence and have an idea that the sequence is well thought out, and stick to the sequence is really what's most important. So in the first 4 weeks, I think it's about 4 sound letter patterns that are introduced at once. So there'll be 4. So then by the end of the 4th week, they've got about 16 that they can use. And there's then what we start doing is introducing new codes. We call them codes, but GPC, same thing. We introduce new codes every week then, and it's usually about 2 extra ones every week because we start introducing 2-letter codes before we ever expecting them to start using them in their reading or their spelling. So they'll get exposed to, you know, like the Autumn Gillingham, they'll have like the phonogram. So we'll show a code like they learnt TH, for instance, many weeks before they needed to use that in their reading because it's quite a difficult digraph. But they learnt it was, and we always do it that they learn the 2 or 3 sounds that the code makes, even though we're really focusing on getting them to say the first or spell with the first sound initially. So, and that is really handy later on when you start explaining why some words like the S code is, you know, it actually says 2 sounds, so z, and it's really handy later on when you start getting words like is and was, that there's a really easy way to be like, oh, sometimes the S makes its second sound, so is and was, so it's still fine. We spell it with an S, it's not spelled with a Z. So that introduction, even in a subtle way of saying this is the z code holding up the S, then that just gets them to know that, you know, different GPCs will say different sounds, and it's okay to have more than one sound. In fact, it becomes the norm later on. So they'll get introduced to the TH, though they learn it as th, and we have this big focus on the phonemic awareness of it and the making it with the teeth and the tongue going through the teeth interdentally. And the kids really, you know, that's really hard for some of them because at 5-year-olds, as a speech pathologist, I know that they're not expected to have that mastered until around the age of 7 or 8, but they can start being aware of it and start even using it in their spelling, even if they're not able to produce it, which is what I've seen in my classroom. I've still got, you know, 7 or 8 kids out of the 20 that can't say that sound, but they can hear that sound and they can hear when it's meant to be used. So it's really interesting how that if you start honing that phonemic awareness early and really having that daily practice of phonemic awareness, which we do for about 3 or 4 minutes without letters, and then the rest of it's phonemic awareness in the context of letters. So we have that mix. Then the kids really have that awareness really early of those sounds and mapping those to the codes that we're showing them as well. So I've forgotten what your original question was, but yeah, they get those original code, they get those codes sort of, eventually it becomes about 2 a week, and now they're starting to get long vowels. So they've had a week where it's E, so double E, and they'll have E as in like each, which they learn as E, A, for example. And some of those vowels will be different depending on your accent as well. So they'll have different combinations of vowels, especially the long vowels just sound very different.
Of course. Well, that's great. Now, one thing that we didn't discuss is when you first got those students at the beginning of the year, which is February for you guys.
Yeah, at the end of January. Yep. Yeah, it's confusing.
Is there anything that you do when you first get them to kind of see where their skills at? Do you have any screening?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we actually bring them in the year before. So we bring them in. So in Northern Hemisphere, it would be a few months before. So before the end of the previous school year, we bring them in and we do some phonemic awareness screening and some letter sound awareness screening. So it's not a measure of their reading ability, but it's those pre-literacy skills which are so important, which we talked about last time. And we also get a brief measure of their oral language as well. So we do like a narrative language measure where we read a story and get them to tell it back. And that was really useful because it meant that we had an idea of who our learners were at day 1, and we actually allocated some of them to additional support from day 1, which I know sounds a little bit intense, but it actually meant that we knew who those kids who are likely to have difficulty with the first few weeks of school and to make the connection between letters and sounds in the initial stages, or to hear the differences between sounds because of that phonemic awareness difficulty. And it means that a lot of those kids that we early identified have now actually caught up and are no longer needing extra support because they're able to keep pace with their peers. So those screeners are really great. And we use things from Easy CBM, which I'm not sure if that's a measure that's used in Canada as well, but any of those curriculum-based measures are good enough for that sort of level, but there's also more, if you have a speech pathologist available, they can do more in-depth things with those students that are struggling particularly with aspects of phonemic awareness, or you might use, say, some David Kilpatrick resources like the past assessment or something like that to help hone in a little bit deeper with some of those students. And the other thing we do is we let we then see how they progress in the first 4 weeks of school. And after the first, I think, week 5, we then do a CVC test where we see if they can read some VC and CVC words. And the students that have a lot of difficulty with that, because after 5 weeks they've done a lot of CVC and VC practice, then we give them that additional support as well. And some of those who like sort of were flagged at week 5 have now received that support, and now some of them were different to the ones we identified early because maybe their challenge was more about the integration between sounds and letters. Now they've received that support, and most of them are back into the general as well, and not having to be pulled out anymore. They're just staying with the group the entire time. So I'd say in my class there's about 1 or 2 students that I'm still much more vigilant about and wanting to make sure, and some of them have issues with fine motor and things like that as well. So they've got some other challenges as well, which we're trying to get on top of. Early screening is really useful, and it really just makes the job of the classroom teacher easier because you're helping keep that group together as a whole, and you're not holding anyone back, but you're also you're ensuring that no one gets left behind. That's the important thing.
Well, I love how you guys do that, especially because when you think about it logistically, that first month or 2 in school, typically the support teachers have a lot more flexibility in their schedule as the other teachers in the higher grades are sorting things out. So you might be able to throw them away for, a block here, block there, and just say, look, you know what, we just want to focus on these skills with these students. They get that intensive intervention. And when other teachers I really need the support time.
Yeah.
I borrowed an hour from you here, take an hour there, trading things off.
It's really useful. Yeah, exactly.
And you're able to get things, hit the ground running, which is great. And especially when at this point their brain is so plastic. And
I think there's arguments because obviously they're ready to learn, but they're also, some people would say, the first term everyone should just settle in and give them, make it really easy and everything. And obviously we don't have a full schedule going from week 1, but we do have that focus on the forms approach, which is the literacy skills block. So if nothing else, that forms lesson is happening every day. And I think other things then get added in. So we start with maybe 1 or 2 writing sessions a week, and then we build it up to 3 or 4, and now it's up to 5 in halfway through the year. And the same for reading. We start with 1 or 2 sessions, then it builds up to 3 or 4. Now it's going to be 5 as well. So the whole literacy block has still now finally come together that it's 5 days a week, 3 sessions a day, which ends up being about 150 minutes a day, which is a lot of time, but we feel like it's really useful for, especially in the early years. But I think you're right. You've got to use that time when they're ready to go, and you also want to set them up so that they don't, because they're potentially doing a lot of reading at home, and it depends on what kinds of readers they're reading at home as well. Whether they might be, our government gives the parents guides which might be doing the opposite of what we're wanting them to do, which is to really look at the words and really understand the connection between sounds and letters and start to decode and using decodable text makes that so much easier. But if they've got other information that parents have had access to, and they might be, using other multi-cueing strategies, for instance, such as looking at the picture or guessing from the sentence or looking at predictable books or memorizing lists of sight words and things, then that can start to interfere, I think, with what we're trying to do. So if we go sort of really clear and really sort of vigilant early, then we start to set them up on the right track. And we didn't send readers home until right towards the end of the first term, so it's week 10 or 11. And for some students who didn't get that basic decoding or blending, not until halfway through the second term, so it was week 15 of the whole year. So, and the reason is we don't want them to be sent home books that they're not going to be able to decode, and that parents think that it's their job to get them to guess, or that the parent's job is to read it for them and just make them copy, which is not, we want them to really get in there and decode. They were reading obviously other books and rich literature, and parents reading to the children, and that's for the purpose of developing oral language and appreciation of literature, and we're never preventing that. But when you're trying to get that independent reading happening, as you've been saying, you really want to set up those really good habits from the beginning and teach them that reading is a process of really looking at each individual word and mapping those words. And eventually they become automatically recognized, and the children don't even know how they've done it. They've just read it. But you want them getting to there not by memorization of whole words, but by really analyzing the sound letter patterns and blending them together. So getting that phonemic awareness to link with that orthographic knowledge, and eventually the morphological knowledge as well. And that's when all the sweet stuff happens, because you've got independent readers who can read any word.
Of course. Well, and I'd argue, you said the caution about hitting the ground running and everything, but when you're looking at phonological awareness and basic alphabetic letters, that's not really heavy, intensive
No, it's
work,
fun. Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Those are fun word games that kids get excited about, and you can really work on that rapport building while you're doing it.
Exactly. And the other things we do in the early stages are a really fun, read to learn unit from the core knowledge sequence, which looks at nursery rhymes. And the kids, it's a beautiful introduction, because it's like a bridge between preschool and formal school, because a lot of them know these nursery rhymes, and rather than just singing them, we're also analyzing them and trying to understand the meaning. Like, what, roses are red, violets are blue. What is a rose? How is it different to a violet? And they get that opportunity to really enjoy language and think about it. So that mixed with the phonics skills and the phonemic awareness that we're building from the early sort of few weeks, it is a beautiful introduction to schooling. And I just remember so much, little faces lighting up of how fun that introduction was, even though we're also making really good use of that time, and ensuring that we don't get to halfway through the year and we realize, oh, there's half of our class can't blend or can't decode basic VC words. Like, that would be then a big challenge, and I feel like you're constantly battling to catch up, which is not what you want.
Yeah, it's putting that the fence around the river at the top instead of catching them at the bottom, falling down the waterfall, right?
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So that prevention or that vigilance early can just save you so much time and so much, as I said about the bad habits, you don't want students thinking that reading is a guessing game and that you just have to guess at the words and it'll suddenly work. You want them to know that there's a key to unlock with literacy, and that you can, if you learn those building blocks, that you can then attack any word. And when you, like some of my students this year, when they've finally realized that, oh, this is what you do when you want to read a new word, they'll come to school so proud and they say, I can read now. And they have this they have this pride in, I figured it out. I know what to do. You say the sounds and then you blend them together, and then you can read the word. And then they show their friends, like, I can read this word, and they go g, dog, and they're just so excited that they can do it. And that's the beauty of the decodable text as well, is that you are giving them words that are readable and that they can actually access it at their level of orthographic knowledge. I think you're setting them up for feeling successful, rather than, reading so hard, it must be just a guessing game. Or why do some kids get it and other kids don't? Everyone can get it, and everyone has the opportunity to learn it. Even those students who are at risk for dyslexia, have that opportunity to get those correct ways of attacking words from the beginning, not giving them things that are going to get them on the wrong start to reading and thinking it is a memorization sort of approach. And so many of those students I've worked with before being in the classroom as a speech pathologist, you just see that if they had that initial instruction in, really attacking words and looking at the words and looking at letter by letter, so much time would have been saved, and so much frustration would have been avoided, because you're now having to undo all of those strategies where, this child has got a dyslexic brain, which means that learning those GPCs is going to be harder. It's going to be, you need more instruction, more time, more focus, more intensive, more exposures. And, the blending is difficult as well, because they've got a phonological deficit. And so if you've then, the first year of schooling, you've taught them that just look at these predictable books and memorize them, a lot of the time they might have a good memory. So they look like they're reading the whole year, and they look like they're spelling the whole year because they've memorized particular words and they keep using them over and over. So it's only later that they have to unlearn a whole lot of stuff. And that's really soul destroying, I think, when you think you're a good reader and then suddenly you realize you're not. Like, that would be like your world sort of crashing down when you're thinking about how important reading is for the children's sense of, I'm going to school, I'm going to learn to read just like my older brother or like my cousin or whatever it might be.
Of course. And I do want to highlight that when you're doing the screening stuff, you're not diagnosing any of these students with anything. You're
No,
just
and I,
putting,
as a speechy, I could have gone in
yeah,
and been like, oh, I think it's this, or I think it's that. It's literally like a set of indicators that tells us that this child might have more difficulty, and it's a way to prevent instructional casualties. So if we can get on top of this and to provide additional instruction, there's no need for any formal diagnosis if these kids eventually catch up with their peers. They may have been at risk for something, but it hasn't actually eventuated, or it's been literally prevented just by good classroom instruction plus a little bit of tier 2 intervention.
and that saves everybody time, frustration, and money.
Exactly. And just makes school so much more fun. And in the early stages, I can't stress this enough. Like, in the later years in secondary schools where I've worked as well, the idea of doing something different and doing something special is so socially isolating. Like, kids can feel really off put by the idea of not going into the mainstream and having to do something different or something on the side. But in the early years of school, it's like, hey, I get to go and do this special thing, and all of the other kids go, when do I get to go and work with Mrs. X? Like, I want to go and do some extra reading with her. So it's when you do it this early and you do it in a way that's really gentle and really supportive, it doesn't even feel like you're providing intervention. It's just extra time with a teacher. Who doesn't love doing that?
Exactly. So let's take a look at those blocks section by section. So the first three or
Sure.
4 minutes are the phonological awareness. What are you doing?
So we've got basically a sequence of exercises that sort of have a range of CVC, VC words and then CVC words, and that build up over time. And we're basically blending those. So I'll give the sounds, and we're blending them together using like a visual of some dots or using our fingers, and then we're also segmenting. So I'll say a word and we segment the word together. So it starts off really, really simple, like everyone say at. Let's see, hear the sounds in at. Who can hear the first sound? At. And then what's the second sound? T. So I've got two sounds. So I have a representation like two magnets on the board with at. And there will be a list of 10 words that we go through and do that with. And it'll, kids will pick up the patterns and they'll talk about what they can hear the difference of. And if we need to, we'll do some cued articulation to hearing the difference between some of those vowels. And we'll show the shape that the mouth is in to make those sounds and those patterns. And it's literally just 3 minutes. And over time, that just gets a little bit more sort of advanced. And our phonemic awareness tends to be about 3 or 4 weeks ahead of what we then do in decoding. So we do VC and then eventually CVC, and then a few weeks later we're doing CVC with the kids with reading, and then you will move on to CVCC first, so final consonant added, and then we'll do a second consonant at the start, and then we'll do 3 consonants at the end. I think at the moment we're up to 2 consonants at the start and 2 at the end, so CCVCC, or the other way around for your viewing. And kids aren't reading those words just yet, not in the general sort of, and reading and spelling those just yet in the phonics component, but they are learning to hear those sounds. And for some of them, it's a really great opportunity to then hear which students are having trouble with those internal consonants, which ones are just, when you're hearing the word like stop, they're just saying stop. They can't hear the t in there. Or if you're giving them the sounds like st, op, they can't hear the t, so they're just saying sop. So it's really useful because you can then address and really hone that instruction with those particular students who are having trouble hearing those internal consonants or hearing the differences between different vowels. So getting, it's going to sound different in an Australian accent, but like the et, like in egg, or the it, like in, which sounds probably very similar to you, like the it, like in igloo. Hearing the difference between et and it can be really difficult. There's a difference between at and et can be hard for some kids. So getting those down pat and letting them hear the differences between those vowels is also the focus of that first 3 minutes. And as I said, that builds over time and it stays a little bit ahead of what we're doing in the next component, which is the reading and spelling part.
Okay. Well, in the reading and spelling part, I guess more the spelling part, when you're first doing that, are you helping them segment the word into the number of phonemes before you're not just,
Definitely.
okay, well, we
It's
did that in the last 3 minutes. Now your turn, you're on your own.
definitely it's for the first 4 or 5 weeks. It's mainly teacher modeled. So we're doing it together and we're modeling it and doing. So it's the I do and the we do. It's very little you do. So they don't really independently spell many words for the first few weeks. They basically just transcribing what they're hearing and writing or using magnetic letters to represent the sounds that they're hearing in those words. So we'll, in the first week, they've got 4 sounds to work with. So we'll do words like sat and tap and things like that. Only one vowel, I think, and yeah, SATP. So only one vowel and 3 consonants. So they're just doing some combinations of those words, and it's really just teacher modeling. So I hear, let's read these words on the screen. So we'll have maybe 5 or 6 words for them to read, and we'll read each individual one together. It'll be VC, 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 and then maybe one CVC at the end. And then we'll go and we'll on our little whiteboards or using magnetic letters, or some of them, if they're ready to write, they'll start writing in the first few weeks. They'll then represent those sounds. So they'll go, I can hear at has got 2 sounds, at. So let's write the sound for at. And then I've written it on the board already, so they can copy A, because they might not know that yet. And then they're still learning how to form letters, obviously. Or they will use the A from the magnetic letters as well to go ah. And then I can hear a second sound, t, t. And they write the T. And, as the things go on, it obviously sounds very simple to begin with. But now they're at the point where I'll give them a word like, I'll be able to get to the point where I give them a word like, I think we've done like the word left. So I'll say left and I'll model the sounds, and we'll use, like we call it finger spelling. So we'll go ul, f, t. So I hear 4 sounds. I'll do 4 dots on the board. They're already back at their tables at this point because they've read that word already, and then they'll spell that word, and a lot of them will just launch straight into it, and they'll write down the sound they can hear for ul, and then they'll write the sound they can hear for and then f, t. And some of them will leave out a sound or will wait and sort of suss it out until I start modeling, and usually I'll just start putting sound by sound every 10 or 30 seconds. And so if they're really struggling, they'll then copy, and I'll go to them, I'll say ul, and we'll write down the and then ft. But 19 out of 20 are now starting to write those words independently and might only miss 1 or 2 sounds, or hear, muck up the difference between the E and the I, for instance. So we're now at that CVCC level, and also starting to do CCVC as well. So those are 2 consonants at the start, which is amazing because we're only halfway through the year, and they're already starting to represent more than just a CVC word in their spelling, which just opens up so many different kinds of words that they can then start reading and start writing as well. So any word that we get them to spell, they've already had a chance to blend and so read it and blend it and decode it together, and we'll do that together on the mat. And we do that through lots of teacher modeling, and we'll also, at the start before that, we'll also have a review of all the previous sort of weeks. So we'll have a selection from previous weeks of different words that we've read and spelt, and we'll write some of those on the whiteboards as well. Then we'll go back to our tables and write the focus words for that day. So that's where it really gets really exciting, because they get that opportunity to show what they've then read and then practice spelling it. And there's that great knowledge, I think, that comes from actually getting good at spelling makes you a much better reader. So if you're able to represent the sounds and know how to map them, then it helps you be much more reflexive when you then are reading. You can look at what you're reading and really analyze it because you know how to spell that word already. So rather than just reading it and memorizing, patterns and things like that, you're actually analyzing every single word that you're reading. And it does that having that reading and spelling so close to each other really does allow for that generalization of those GPCs and the skills that you're building over time to be much more close, rather than just read, and then in the next lesson we'll do some spelling. I think that link between reading and spelling back and forth is just so key.
Well, and I think that's what a lot of schools are missing. Their reading program and their spelling program are separate.
Are different, yeah.
And not related. And especially in those older grades, you're not seeing the connection between, the letter sounds that they're working on, or the code knowledge that they're working on. And then when they're reading, reading on something that has nothing to do with it. So it's not using that ability to optimize what you're doing. at
Mm.
the same time to help them be familiar with that code.
Mm. And in the forms curriculum, that process of reading and then spelling just stays the same, even if they're working on spelling rules in like the later years. They're learning, the silent final E rule, and they're learning about adding suffixes and things like that, and what happens with doubling or dropping the E, or changing Y to I, all of those sort of spelling rules. And then also when they change to morphemes and morphological knowledge, we're still reading those words and spelling those words, just constantly reading and spelling, so that there is that intimate connection. And this is where I'm not sure if I mentioned this last time. Is I'll on yard duty I'll come up and I'll hear students debating about how you spell a particular word, or which morpheme should go where, or how to analyze it, and what the word history might be, because they're just so engrossed in words and learning how they fit together, and because they've just done so much reading and spelling in that 20 minutes every single day all the way through their primary schooling, they just see it in their minds. Like they're really good at oral spelling. They don't even need to have paper in front of them to have a debate about how to spell a word, which is so good. I think it just shows that they're invested in words, and they care about whether they're right or not, about how, where that word comes from, or how that word's put together. And it's just lovely to know that there is so much joy in feeling success as well. You're not just teaching this stuff for the sake of it. You're teaching it because it helps them to become lovers of language, and lovers of what they're trying to do with their words, and how eventually spelling becomes something that's much more background, and that's sort of in you're only really thinking about it when you're spelling really difficult irregular words. But it frees up all that thinking to then focus on the meaning of what you're reading about or what you're writing about, and how to craft a great composition and everything. So it not only makes them lovers of language, but also enables them to free up their working memory to really focus on all the other parts of literacy, which is so important.
Of course. And I think as we're doing this, we're actually teaching parents some things at the same time as they learn along with their children. That does happen. I know it, like from personal experience, as someone that went through the Orton Gillingham program to learn how to read, whereas my husband didn't have any issues. And I'll be explaining something to my kids, and then he's like,
Mm.
I never knew that. And it's like,
Yeah,
you
because he
did. It
hadn't,
makes
he
sense.
wasn't explicitly aware. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, the one thing that I do want to highlight to listeners is you were working with students who, I mean, technically, some of them could probably be 4 years old at the time that you start working with them, just because of how the grade works.
Of speech, how speech pathologists work. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, and I don't know how it
Oh,
works
you're talking about in the classroom.
in the
Oh, yeah.
class.
Most of them have turned 5. So by February, all of them should have turned 5. That's sort of how it sort of works. So
Oh,
within the first, yeah. So
in
I think the cutoff
Canada,
is like March. Yeah. Yeah.
in Canada, you'll still have, and in the States, you'll still have some 4 year olds for the first couple months of school.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah. It's similar. I think similar here, but most of them, yeah.
the
By now,
vast
everyone's
majority are
5. Yeah.
5. It's in their
Yeah.
5th year that they're starting with you. And then by the
Yeah.
end of the school year, some of them are already 6. So we're
Yeah.
talking
True.
about young students, and you're having this success, and you are an amazing teacher and have a wonderful program. But this isn't unique to you, and where you're
No. This is just our
how
way
to
of getting
happen.
the research. Yeah.
Of
Just
course.
getting the research
Yeah.
to come to life in the classroom. Anyone can do this. Exactly.
Yeah. So listeners, don't think, oh, well, I'm not in Australia. I don't have Dr. Swain's background. I can't do this. That's not true. You can do it in a remote community in Canada, the United States, in England, in New Zealand. It is possible. It is knowledge that is accessible to you. And yes, there may be a little bit of accent difference based on programs, but that's nothing that you can't filter out and adjust.
Mm.
So that's
And I
important.
know I'm plugging that the forms program a little bit, and that's spelled at PHORMES, because it stands for phonology, orthography, morphology, and etymology and semantics. Which, if you know your linguistics, that's sort of the main components of figuring out words. So the other benefit is that it is a free open source curriculum that we've put together, and it's not all complete and are made available as yet, but the author Shane Pearson, who's at my school, is tirelessly working to get that already by the end of sort of December this year. So if people wanted to start using some of those resources, that there's things that are available already. As you mentioned, you might want to adapt certain things to make it work for your accent or to make it work for your context. But those resources hopefully help to save a lot of the time and energy that teachers have to put into just getting things sorted and organizing all of those materials that they need on hand. Because the beauty of the program, in my view, is that there's no script or anything, so I don't have to read from a script. So there is a bit of work to figure out how you want it to come to life in your classroom, but I don't have to think of the words that I want them to focus on. I don't have to think of, what is the content of what we're doing. I can just focus completely on what my students are doing and how they're doing it and how I can best explain it to them. Because I know it's hard to do both of those things at once. Like, what word should I focus on today? And how can I think of these? I've got these GPCs I've come up with. Which word should I then build from there? It's really difficult work. So if these words appear before you and that's done in a particular sequence and it's reviews and it's all built in there as well, then like any good curriculum, it takes some of that guesswork out of that day-to-day practice, and frees you up as a teacher to focus on what your students are doing and what you're doing to best explain it, which is, it's just amazing. I can't advocate more strongly for having a really robust sequence and a set of curriculum documents to work from.
Of course. And do you feel that in a lot of places, people worry about that taking away teacher autonomy, having a program? Do you feel that that's doing it, or is it giving you more because you have that time to focus on how you want to deliver it and the other parts of your instruction?
I was having a debate with a few teachers on the and other people in the education space about whether it does impact on teacher autonomy and whether it's right to have a sequence at all. There's some teachers who believe that there should be no sequence, because they've taught in a way that's much more driven around what students are writing, and then if they're having certain spelling errors in their writing, then you just teach those things. And I feel like if I taught in that way, it would be exhausting, first of all, and so much more work. But it also wouldn't be as systematic and as carefully planned, and having a much stronger net to catch those students who won't be making those connections if it was a much more sort of bespoke, on the fly sort of created program. The enacted curriculum is always going to come to life in the classroom in some way, but where it's coming from, I think, should be from something that's been put together in a really thought out way, in a really clear way. It doesn't have to be a program that you've built, or a program that you've bought. It could be something that you build yourself if you want to put that time in, but there are good things out there to save you that time. In terms of my autonomy, I think it gives me the freedom to really focus on what I'm doing in the classroom. I don't have to think about which sound letter patterns am I introducing today. I know that the sequence is solid and that it's introducing the right number and the right frequency, and it's getting me through that opportunity to teach students how to read and write in a clear and a systematic way. So my autonomy is really about how I then enact that in the classroom, and how I help that come to life for my students. So if anything, it gives me the autonomy then to focus on the other parts of the curriculum, which are more sort of topic driven. So looking at our read to learn units, like thinking about which topics do we want to focus on first, which units do we want to come to life, how do we want those independent activities to look, and what are we asking students to do with that learning. So there's so much more thinking and autonomy that's involved in that part of teaching, that I don't need to be autonomous in how I teach decoding and encoding in terms of the what. I think if someone tells me the what, and if that's a sequence that's been put together by someone who's experienced and knows what they're talking about, and it reflects the research, then I'm going to put my faith in that and see it come to life. And the other thing is that if people use these materials and they've got feedback, like this is a resource, and just like other resources that are out there that do continually get better. And so there's things that I'm sure the author of Forms Shane Pearson will also take into account and make adjustments and things like that. So it's better for our collective brains to come together to improve resources like these, to improve these sorts of sequences, than just individual teachers having to make them from scratch. Breaks my heart, the idea of teachers around the world basically doing the same PowerPoint presentation or the same set of worksheets, or highlighting the same things and writing the same things on the board from scratch every single day, when they could be actually investing that time in other things. Like, that's time that could be put towards so many more important activities as a teacher, of getting to know your students, of understanding what they're doing in the classroom, of providing that one-on-one support, of getting to know the families that might need that additional guidance, or giving them strategies for at home. Like, there's a myriad of things that teachers could be doing with their time. So anything that helps them to free up that mental space and that time so that they can be a better responsive teacher, I think is definitely something I'm a fan of.
Of course. And not to mention lessen the load on you and hopefully help prevent that teacher burnout.
Exactly. It's like there's enough coming at you as a teacher that you don't want to have to literally create everything from scratch for every day that you teach. And it's hard to sustain that. So if you can't be as prepared as you want to be, teachers then have to sort of do some things on the fly and have a very loose plan for what they might do for the week. And whether that produces as good a result as something that's been thought out and something that's been put together systematically and has the resources to go with it, then I think you can't argue with how you'd want to be the teacher that has their resources all ready and ready to go and ready to implement, rather than like, oh, I don't know exactly which words I'm going to get them to spell today. I'll just think of it on the spot. My ability to think of words on the spot is nowhere near as good as my ability to look at a sequence that's been put together and say, well, that's going to work and that's not going to work. And that's where the autonomy is that I decide, okay, there's 6 words here for us to spell. I'm going to do 3 of them because that's all the time that I've got. And I'm going to choose the ones that I think are going to work the best for this particular moment. And I still am in charge of my classroom. There's no one telling me what to do on a minute by minute or hour by hour basis. But it's given me that opportunity to have the time on the weekend to do something that's good for me and for my well-being, rather than constantly working all the time. That's not what we want, and it's the reason why so many teachers do burn out in the first 5 years.
Of course, and that's too bad because it takes a lot of heart to be a teacher, and those who even just
Ah,
do their teacher education program, we want to do everything that we can to support them and have that fresh new enthusiasm for as long as they can.
exactly. You don't want them to feel like it's you just become an administrative drone, like you're constantly having to make things and do things and send things, and like there's this whole administrative part of teaching that's really grown over the last 15 years or so, as far as I can tell, and from my understanding of working now, it's a big burden, and anything that schools can do to reduce that administrative work, the better, because teachers are paid to teach, and if they're not being able to be their best in the classroom and also stay in the classroom for as many years as possible, then that's a wasted resource in many ways. Like that teachers could have been there for many years and become an incredible educator, or rise to become a leading teacher in another school, and so on and so forth. But if you're losing all of those people that have got so much heart but are really strained by the workload and strained by the system, then yeah, it's heartbreaking to think that you have to start that process all again with someone else who wants to change their career and start from teaching from scratch. Because then your classrooms and your schools are filled with people who are very new to teaching, and there's already so much to get your head around as a new teacher. That experience is really valuable, and you want to keep as many experienced teachers in there as possible.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Swain. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope to have more in the future because you're just a wealth of knowledge, and we only got through, I think, the first 10 or 15 minutes.
That's true. Yeah, I had the discussion of handwriting and reading fluency ready to go as well. But yeah, we can have another discussion at another time, I'm sure. There's so much in this. It's like it's 15 minutes of my day, but there is so much to talk about in what goes into that, and why it's like that, and I guess the things that I've learned as well along the way that help to help that come to life for teachers. So any chance to share that with others, I'll take, even if it's only a snippet that we've been able to cover today.
Of course.